The story begins on a bright and sunny afternoon, where a man named Frank stepped out of prison, breathing into fresh air for the first time in 14 years. Once, he had been a powerful mafia boss, controlling a vast network of illegal businesses across New York City. But things had changed. While Frank was locked away, rival gangs, the Colombian and Chinese drug cartels, had taken over his empire, wiping out his old allies and leaving him with nothing. Across the city, a man named Emilio, who ran a prostitution business for the Colombians, left his establishment and walked to a nearby payphone. Just as he picked up the receiver, a sudden burst of gunfire tore through the air. During the chaos, Emilio also shot and immediately collapsed. Soon, the killers coldly dropped a newspaper beside his body, its headline announcing Frank's recent release. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit hotel room, a man named Jimmy was negotiating a drug deal with King Tito, a notorious Colombian drug lord. Unfortunately, Jimmy's nonstop talking irritated King Tito, who suddenly raised the price of the drugs by 10%. Unprepared for the change, Jimmy hesitated, but then reluctantly handed over a suitcase as payment. When King Tito opened it, his smug expression vanished. Inside the suitcase were only tampons. Before he could react, Jimmy pulled out a gun and shot him and his men, leaving no survivors. Once the job was done, Jimmy and his crew made their way to another hotel where Frank was waiting for them. It quickly became clear that Jimmy and his gang were working under Frank's orders. They confirmed that both Emilio and King Tito had been eliminated and that they had seized their money and businesses. Jimmy also informed Frank about an upcoming meeting with a middleman named Delicio. Apparently, Frank, eager to reclaim his position, prepared to meet him in a high-end venue. At the meeting, Frank was surrounded by his trusted lawyers, influential politicians, and even a district judge. He turned his attention to Delicio, instructing him to set up a meeting with a powerful drug cartel boss named Clay, as he wanted Clay to believe he was ready to restart his operations. After the discussion, Frank left with a counselor named Jennifer, taking a leisurely walk through the subway. Shortly after, Delicio arrived at a busy gambling den, where he found Clay enjoying a game with his friends. He then delivered Frank's message, but Clay scoffed at the idea of meeting him. He dismissed Frank as someone who was now dealing with the wrong people, insisting that he only did business with the Colombians. Without a second thought, Clay sent Delicio away with a firm rejection. Back in the subway, Frank and Jennifer were enjoying their time together when three young thugs approached them, trying to provoke Frank. But the moment they spotted the gun tucked under his jacket, their confidence disappeared. Instead of punishing them, Frank surprised them by handing over a stack of cash, telling them to meet him at a hotel if they wanted a better future. Soon after, Frank and his men, now aware of Clay's refusal, moved quickly. They confronted Clay in his own territory. At that moment, Frank made it clear, if business was going to happen in New York, he had to be part of it. Despite this, Clay, still defiant, refused the offer once again. Hearing this, Frank immediately pulled the trigger, killing Clay on the spot. With Clay out of the way, Frank began reaching out to his former associates, gathering support to reclaim his empire. Later, Frank paid a visit to the mayor's office, demanding to know why funds meant for a Bronx hospital had not been released. The mayor dismissed Frank's concerns, arguing that no money had been allocated for the project. At one moment, the mayor challenged Frank to raise $16 million on his own if he truly cared. Against his lawyer's advice, Frank accepted the challenge, determined to make it happen. As Frank relaxed with a drink, three detectives, Tommy, Roy, and Dennis, stormed in and took him away without explanation. His lawyer tried to intervene, but they ignored him, dragging Frank through traffic in a way that ensured they left no trail behind. Moments later, they stopped in a deserted alley and revealed an unconscious, battered man, Enrico, a leader of the Colombian drug cartel. The detectives believed Frank was responsible for the deaths of three top cartel leaders, all of whom had been eliminated since his release. But Frank, calm and collected, denied any involvement. In the end, frustrated but lacking evidence, the detectives had no choice but to let him go. Meanwhile, Delicio arranged a secret meeting with Wong, a powerful Chinese triad boss, inside a dark movie theater. He delivered Frank's proposal for a business deal, but Wong was skeptical. As a result, Wong demanded full cash payment for a shipment weighing 220 pounds, knowing that Frank didn't have that kind of money. To keep the negotiations open, Delicio suggested a face-to-face meeting between Wong and Frank, hoping they could reach a compromise. The next day, Jimmy stopped by a fast food restaurant, where he kindly gave money to an elderly woman and her grandchildren. Just as he was about to leave, a group of detectives and police officers suddenly appeared, surrounding him. With no way to escape, Jimmy was arrested, accused of murdering several Colombians. The key evidence against him was the testimony of Enrico, a powerful cartel member. Meanwhile, Frank visited a struggling hospital in the Bronx, which was in dire need of government funding. He once again approached Wong about a deal, but they could not agree on a fair price for Wong's merchandise. Frank proposed a partnership where they would sell the goods together and split the profits to support the hospital. However, Wong refused and insisted on receiving full cash payment up front. Back at his hotel, Frank received troubling news: Jimmy had been arrested. Determined to set things right, he immediately ordered his crew to organize a rescue mission. Later that night, Jennifer and the team successfully broke Jimmy out of custody. Soon after, the detectives, Tommy, Roy, and Dennis, arrived at the scene, furious to see Jimmy walk free. Unexpectedly, Jennifer warned them that if they interfered, the matter would be settled in court. Sometime later, Frank and his men arrived in Chinatown, quickly identifying the Triad gang members. Without hesitation, they launched a brutal attack, eliminating all opposition. After the bloodbath, they captured Wong, forcing him to reveal the locations of his hidden assets. But even after giving up everything, Wong was not spared. Frank ensured his swift execution. A few days later, thanks to Frank's substantial donation, the Bronx hospital finally opened to the public. This infuriated Detective Dennis, who felt powerless, believing that Frank had become untouchable while they remained stuck in minor roles. Not only that, he also argued that as long as Frank had wealth and influence, the law would always be on his side. Frustrated, Dennis proposed forming a rogue group of detectives to take down Frank through any means necessary, treating it like a war between rival gangs. Roy, however, disagreed with this reckless idea, but Dennis ignored his warnings. One evening, at a lively nightclub, Frank's crew was celebrating while he stepped aside to make a phone call. After a while, Delicio arrived with a drug cartel boss from Los Angeles. Apparently, the man knew about the 200-pound shipment Frank had obtained from Wong and wanted to buy it. However, he could only afford half the payment up front, offering to pay the rest after selling it in Los Angeles. Hearing this, Frank immediately refused, insisting that the entire payment be made at once. The cartel boss requested time to inspect the goods first. But as soon as he stepped outside, he suddenly shot one of Frank's guards, exposing his true intentions. It became clear that Delicio had betrayed Frank and was working with the cartel boss. Shortly after, armed men stormed the club, unleashing chaos. Amidst the gunfire, Frank managed to help Jimmy escape. But as they drove away, an attacker clung to the car door. Jimmy tried to knock him off, but was shocked to discover that he was an undercover cop. Without hesitation, Frank grabbed a fire extinguisher and struck the officer, killing him instantly. Seeing this, the remaining attackers, revealed to be Tommy and Dennis, launched a relentless pursuit. The chase was intense, filled with gunfire and high-speed maneuvers. After a long pursuit, Frank finally managed to lose Tommy and Dennis. But just when they thought they were safe, Frank suddenly rammed his car into theirs, causing a violent crash. Wasting no time, Jimmy opened fire, forcing Tommy and Dennis into a desperate battle for survival. Despite this, Tommy managed to escape the wreck and chased after Jimmy, while Dennis lost track of Frank in the wreckage. Later, under a bridge, a single gunshot rang out. Tommy was hit. At that moment, Jimmy showed no mercy, firing more bullets into his body, leaving him on the brink of death. However, before he could escape, Dennis arrived and shot Jimmy multiple times, killing him instantly. Filled with anger and sorrow, Dennis rushed to help Tommy, but it was too late. His longtime partner and friend had succumbed to his injuries. At Tommy's funeral, Dennis couldn't bring himself to stay as he's still overcome with grief. When Dennis left the procession and entered his car, Another vehicle quietly pulled up beside him. Soon, the window rolled down, revealing Frank. Without hesitation, Frank pulled the trigger, ending Dennis's life before calmly driving away. Back at his headquarters, Frank confronted Delicio, who had been captured by his men. During the brutal interrogation, Delicio revealed that Enrico had been working with the police to bring Frank down. He admitted to receiving $50 million in exchange for exposing Frank's secret hideout, believing it would grant him freedom. Upon hearing of this treachery, Frank made his decision. Delicio would be buried along with the money he had sold his soul for. Late at night, Roy arrived home, only to find Frank already inside, waiting for him. At that moment, Frank admitted to killing Clay, a man who had gained $13 million through gambling scams, as well as Wong, a Chinatown businessman involved in smuggling illegal immigrants, and King Tito, the mastermind behind the city's child prostitution ring. Despite this, Frank justified his actions, claiming he only eliminated those who were corrupt and beyond redemption. He warned Roy that if anyone tried to build a case against him, he would not hesitate to hire an assassin to take them out. Before leaving, Frank ordered Roy to handcuff himself to a chair. However, as soon as Frank walked out, Roy quickly broke free and ran after him, following him into the subway. Inside a crowded subway car, Frank grabbed a random passenger and used them as a hostage. Roy desperately pleaded with him to surrender, but Frank showed no mercy. He shot the passenger without hesitation. Chaos erupted as terrified passengers screamed and scrambled for safety. Frank then calmly exited the station and flagged down a taxi, attempting to escape. However, it was revealed that Roy had managed to shoot Frank before he got away, leaving him badly wounded. At the same time, the police were alerted to the incident and quickly arrived at the scene. The taxi driver, noticing Frank clutching a gun and bleeding heavily, panicked and jumped out of the vehicle, shouting for help. Within moments, police officers surrounded the taxi, trapping Frank inside. Weakened by his injuries, Frank struggled to stay conscious. His strength slowly faded, and with no way out, he eventually slumped over, succumbing to his wounds. As sirens wailed and officers closed in, the once powerful crime boss took his last breath, bringing his reign to a bloody end. So the moral of the story is, no matter how powerful you think you are, there's always someone ready to betray you, especially if you forgot to make friends outside of crime and corruption. And remember, if your retirement plan involves endless betrayals and backstabbing, maybe it's time to consider a nice quiet job at a coffee shop instead.